and welcome to Knit Pickers PEI. My name is Margaret, and today we're going to be doing a video tutorial on how to do the Kitchener stitch. Now, the Kitchener stitch is used to graft the toe of a sock or the top of your mittens, anything where you want to join two seams together. In our last video, we did a form of the Kitchener stitch using a provisional cast off. And what that means is that we took our finished knitting and then we knit a few more rows in another color, and we then did our Kitchener stitch using that provisional cast off. This time we're going to do it straight off the needles, and it's just a little bit of a different technique. Some people find this easier to do, other people find it a little more challenging. But the benefit of this type of stitch is that if you are, say, joining the seams of a shoulder and there's a lot of stitches on that shoulder seam, you don't need to knit that many rows in waste yarn in a provisional cast off in order to join the seams. So, shall we get started? So here I've finished my little sockette, and I was knitting it using 4 knitting needles, and the 5th was the one that I used to knit with. So the first thing you want to do when you're going to be working the Kitchener stitch is to transfer your stitches onto 2 needles. You're going to be working the top, the instep of your sock, and then the heel side of your sock. So I'm just going to transfer these stitches on the instep side of my sock onto 1 needle. And when you're transferring, you're always slipping the stitch purlwise. So there's 1. And I'm just going to do the same thing over on this side. I'm going to transfer the stitches from 2 needles onto 1. Again, just slipping the stitches purlwise. And there we go. So now we have our stitches set up on 2 needles, and we're ready to start our Kitchener stitch. All the other needles are set aside. So the only other piece of equipment you're going to need is a darning needle or a bodkin. So I've broken the length of my yarn, and I just thread my darning needle. Here we are. So to start, we take our yarn and we thread this yarn purlwise through the first stitch of the front needle. So threading it in purlwise as if I was going to purl that stitch. And then on the back needle, I'm going to thread my needle through the first stitch on the back needle knitwise. So I'm going from the bottom up. In both cases, I'm leaving those stitches on the needle for that first part. Now, I go back to the front needle and I'm going to slip my sewing needle through the first stitch of the front needle in a knitwise fashion from the bottom up, and then I slip that stitch off the needle. So now that I've slipped that first stitch off my front needle, I'm going to take my sewing needle and I'm going to go purlwise into the next stitch on that front needle, and I'm going to leave that stitch on the needle. And now I'm going to go purlwise through the first stitch on the back needle, and slip that off my needle. Then I'm going to go knitwise through the next stitch on the back needle, and I leave that one on the needle. So what you're doing on the front needle is you're going knitwise, slip it off, purlwise, leave it on. Purlwise, slip it off, knitwise, leave it on. And you're going back and forth like that until you reach the end of the row. So let's try that again. We're taking our needle and we're going knitwise through the front needle, slip it off the needle. Then we go purlwise on the front needle, but we're going to leave that stitch on the needle. Then I'm going to go purlwise through the back needle, slip that stitch off, knitwise through the back needle, and leave that stitch on. Knitwise through the front, slip it off, purlwise through the front, and leave that stitch on. Purlwise through the back, slip that stitch off, knitwise through the back, and leave that stitch on our needles. And I'm just going to give that a little snug up now. I wasn't pulling the stitches very tight, but I've snugged it up, and now you're getting a lovely seam. So I'm just going to continue doing that until we reach the very end of our row, and then I'll show you what we do next. Okay, so here we are down to 2 stitches, our last 2 stitches on each needle. So I'm going to come in knitwise on the front stitch, slip that off, and then purlwise on the front stitch, knitwise or purlwise on the back stitch, and slip that stitch off. Whoops, don't want to drop this one. So slip that stitch off the back needle and knitwise on that last stitch. So here we are. We're now down to 1 stitch on each needle. So what we're going to do is we are going to just go through steps 1, 2. So knit through the front stitch on the front needle, and we slip that off the needle. And then we move to our 3rd step. So if you recall, we were doing knitwise on the front and slip off, purlwise on the front, purlwise on the back, slip it off, knitwise on the back, and leaving that on. So now we're just doing knitwise through the front stitch and slip it off, purlwise through the last stitch on the back needle and slip that off, and you have now taken all your stitches off your needles, and you have completely grafted the toe of your sock. I'll just give those stitches a little tug to snug them up, and there you go. So you can see it's a beautiful finished stitch, and if I were to turn this inside out, there's no seam on the inside. And the look, the appearance of the stitch, whether you're using the Kitchener stitch straight off the knitting needles, or for this sock, where we did the Kitchener stitch using a provisional cast off, the appearance is the same. So it really is simply a matter of which technique you prefer to use. Give them both a try, And I'm sure that you'll come up with one that you like a little bit better than the other. They're both equally as good, but one might just be a little more comfortable for you than another. So give it a try and have fun with it. Well, I hope you found that video tutorial to be useful and not so difficult to follow along with. So, it's getting into fall here in Prince Edward Island, and it's a beautiful time to start knitting some socks and some mittens. So if you need socks and mittens too for the upcoming winter, I hope you'll give it a try and you'll have a very successful finished toe of your sock using the Kitchener stitch. I'll see you next time.